Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good whenever you're watching this. I'm Dakota Ragon. I'm your school safety officer at Concord Christian School. And today we're going to be going over, and for some of you, refreshing and maybe new staff, learning about Stop the Bleed. This is one of my favorite courses. It's near and dear to my heart. And the first thing that we always want to talk about with Stop the Bleed is that this is not a first aid course, right? This is a response to a life-threatening bleed, and only a life-threatening bleed. And that's a really heavy way to start it, but that's what we're dealing with today. So this is a comprehensive effort from several major corporations and research foundations throughout the United States: the National Committee on Trauma, the American College of Surgeons, the Committee on Tactical Combat Care, and the National Association of Emergency Medical Techs. So there's a lot of knowledge and experience behind creating this course to try and teach staff, students, anybody how to save a life through this care. Now, this is your one and only warning that you're going to get, that we do cover images and videos that you might find graphic or disturbing. But when we're talking about life-threatening bleeds, we kind of have to look at life-threatening bleeds. So this is the one warning that you get. There are still images and there are some videos. The good news is this time around, you guys have control over skipping the pictures and the videos. So you can kind of do that at your leisure and at your discretion. But there are images and videos in here that some people may find graphic. So when we're discussing this and we're discussing preventable death, the number one cause of a preventable death, which is defined as a death that could have been stopped without even tier 1 trauma care, so anybody can render aid to keep this. The number one cause of preventable death is bleeding. So bleeding control is a major factor in saving a life, or just buying a few minutes and getting to what we call the golden hour. If you can get past a certain amount of time, you have the golden hour to receive the care that you need. So the number one cause of preventable death is bleeding. And lots of times when I'm teaching this class, especially at the education level, you hear, well, why do I need this training? Officer Ragon, why do I need to know this? I'm a teacher, or I'm an aide, or I work in the office or the resource room. Why would I need to know how to stop a life-threatening bleed? Well, outside of even just the what I would find obvious of the higher and higher rate of violent incidents in schools, you can use this anywhere, really. You can use this at a place of worship. You can use this at your home. You can use this in the car. Unfortunately, injuries and accidents happen everywhere. And we call them accidents because they don't happen on purpose, right? We don't plan for these. So this is something that you can use in so many different occasions, so many different places. It's not always a response to a violent incident. It could be a response to an accident. It could be a response to car accident on the way to work. It could be the response to a natural disaster. People get impaled by objects, whether it's from heavy winds, or I saw a video recently where a lady was standing on her front porch and lightning struck a tree at her neighbor's house and shot wood and impaled her with wood. So this is stuff that you can use every day in your home. That's why it's so important to learn. And we have two major keys, two major goals today, right? So the two things that we want to learn today is, number one, we want to learn how to identify, right? That's our first goal, identify. So we're going to recognize a life-threatening bleed. Is it venous? Is it arterial? Is it a capillary bleed? If it's capillary bleed, we're in good shape. If it's venous, all right, we're going to have to render care. If it's arterial, we're really going to have to step up our game. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to be able to recognize how much blood is coming out, where it's coming from, what type of bleeding it is, and that will tell us what kind of care that we need and really how much time that we have to save that life. So goal number one, identify. Goal number two, stop the bleed. Pretty simple, right? Easy. We're not getting real deep into medical care and a whole lot of terminology. So we want to identify the bleed and we want to stop the bleed. Those are our two main goals. And we'll talk more about how we're going to do that and break those down into some easy to remember cares. But that is our big main goals. Before we ever do anything like that, before we identify, before we take measures to stop the bleed, what everybody has to remember is your number one goal, your number one priority, and it's mine too. Officers train this all the time. Your first priority is your safety. And lots of times it's kind of hard for people to wrap their head around, and they see somebody that's injured, that, somebody's hurt. Well, it's a natural response for us to want to help them, and that's great. That's perfect. But even as officers, the first thing that we always do when we get to a situation, scene safety. Scene safety is number one. I can't help anybody. You can't help anybody if you're not safe or you get injured. And my favorite example that really gets people to wrap their head around this subject is if you've ever flown, if you've ever been on a plane, if you've ever flown before, when they're going through their pre-flight safety checklist and they're talking about the oxygen mask coming down, the first thing that they tell you is before you ever help anybody else, before you ever, adjust somebody else's mask or get your kid's mask on or do anything like that, you secure your mask first. Take care of yourself first. And it's not selfish. It's not because you don't care about the other people. It's a simple fact that you can't help somebody if you're in danger. If you get hurt, if you're not safe, you can't help somebody. So your safety is your utmost priority. Number one, if you're injured, if you're dead, you can't save somebody's life. Now, it could be the case that you've already started to render aid. You've helped somebody. Everything was safe, everything was okay, and you identified the bleed, you figured out where they're bleeding, how much blood's coming out, and now you've started rendering aid, and something has happened, something has changed. Violent incidences, or especially natural disasters, are a rapidly evolving, always changing process. So it could be that something has changed, the situation has evolved to where it is no longer safe for you to stay and render aid to this individual. What do I do? Well, you need to leave. You need to leave that spot, that, whatever situation is causing things to be unsafe, you have to remove yourself from it. And if it's possible to take that injured party with you, fantastic. Do that. If you guys ever have a question about maybe a fireman's carry or something that helps you pull somebody, underarm hooks and drags, things like that, be sure to ask me because lots of times moving a person, moving an injured party is a lot more about body mechanics than it is about strength, especially if they're a larger person than you are. So if you ever have those questions, ask me. But if it's possible to take that person with you, do so. If it's not possible, if the situation has evolved to a place where it is a choice between you and them, you have to make that decision that your safety is your utmost priority. And as crude and crass as it sounds, one injured person or one dead person is better than two injured persons or two dead people, right? Unfortunately, at some point, it does become a numbers game. And it doesn't help anybody for you to be injured or you to lose your life at the cost of trying to help somebody else, right? That's my job. That's what I'm here for. So past that, another safety tip, I always carry gloves on me, especially, we're talking about blood. We're talking about dealing with bleeding. Gloves are a wonderful thing because even if that person is not sick and doesn't have any communicable diseases, the mixture of blood, the ingestion of blood, if you get a cut and their blood gets into you, you're going to get sick. You're going to get a disease. So not everybody is in a position where they carry gloves on them at all times like I do. So the gloves are kind of more of a luxury at sometimes. But we do have kits placed all over the building, all over the church, all over the school that do have gloves in them. And I do my best to keep them a nitrile base. A lot of people have latex allergies. It's never fun. I've been in the boat before where I'm rendering aid to somebody and they have a latex allergy, and now I've made the situation worse. I'm trying to help and I'm rubbing something that they're allergic to all over their body, trying to figure out where they're bleeding. So nitrile gloves are great. I keep them in my back, right behind me. I keep a pouch in my back. I keep them all over the church. But that is more of a luxury. So if you have access to gloves, use them. If you don't, and you do get a cut, and you do somehow get a transmutation of blood into your system, you need to contact your primary care provider. As soon as the situation's done, you need to get checked, you need to get a test, and hopefully everything's okay, but if not, they'll be able to give you the proper medication. So those are our safety tips. Those are all the things that we cover before we start rendering aid. When we come onto a scene, we're always going to want to follow our ABCs of bleeding, right? So we kind of make this real simple, especially at the educator levels. We love kind of giving analogies and anagrams to remember to our kids. So we're going to talk about the ABCs of bleeding. It's real simple. A is alert 911. If you are the first person there, if you are the first person to come help, you need to call 911. And you'd be amazed at how, it sounds simple. It sounds like, well, yeah, of course I'm going to do that. You'd be amazed how often that gets forgotten. And not intentionally, nobody wants to deny, the help from emergency services. It's just not something you think about, when your adrenaline's pumping and you're in this high intensity kind of situation. Some of those things go out the window, and law enforcement, we refer to condition black, right? So Cooper's color code of situational awareness. Some people skip straight from white to black, and now they've totally forgotten the steps and everything that they need to do to ensure their safety. I'll even tell on myself a little bit. I went to a class last summer. I went to an interior defense class, and we're talking about active shooters and response to all these things. And we're role playing. There's 26 officers in this room. It's all police officers. It's 26 of us, and we're role playing a classroom, a teacher, kids, things like that. And the bad person comes in and they start doing the bad thing, and they're shooting us with a Nerf gun. And, as officers, all of us want to jump on top of the guy and, hit him as hard as we can. Some run, some play the part. And at 26 of us in the room, not a single person thought to call 911, right? We're doing this drill for over half an hour. Nobody thought to call 911 because it's not the way that I'm programmed, because I'm that person, right? Why would I call them? I'm here. So A is alert 911. And some people, that's their bread and butter. Especially if you're a very detailed-oriented person. I remember when we did this class last year, there was a lot of people that said, hey, I can't be the one that touches somebody's bloody body. I can't do that. I don't do blood. That freaks me out. Well, hey, be the person to call 911. But you have to be detail-oriented, because you're going to call and they're going to ask you lots of questions. Most importantly, the first thing they're going to ask you is, where is your emergency? And this is really easy for me because everybody that's watching this video, you guys are going to be in the same place, right? You work here. So our address is 11704 Kingston Pike. But what you have to remember is your side of the building is different from everybody else's side of the building. If you're in the elementary or the preschool, you're on the south side of the building, So these are things that you're going to have to remember and that are going to change for you. And it might not just be where your classroom is located in the building. It might be where your class is in the moment. If you took your class in front of the gathering space, well, sure, your classroom's normally on the south side, but you're in front of the gathering space, so you're on the north side now. And these are things that you have to learn and you have to be ready to answer, because they're going to ask you those questions. They're going to ask you a long list of questions, and they're going to keep you on the phone as long as they can and try to keep you calm and to monitor the situation. That injured party could be devolving quickly, and that'll let them know how they need to step up the care, what kind of care they need to bring. So if you're going to be that person, be sure that you're detail-oriented. They're going to ask you all sorts of things. And never hang up on the operator. They will always hang up with you when they're done. Never hang up on them. Causes all sorts of confusion and problems that we don't want. So that's our A, right? A is alert 911. B is bleeding. So this goes into that first goal that we're going to talk about. Identify. So we talked about venous or arterial or capillary bleeds. Capillary bleeds we're not going to worry about too much today. The two main types we're going to talk about is venous and arterial. Mostly because we want to know the difference and how to identify an arterial bleed. That's the widowmaker. That's the one that's scary. Typically, numbers change, and body mass and how quickly somebody bleeds out changes. But what we usually train for and we usually talk about is 2 minutes. If someone has an arterial bleed, whether it's the carotid artery, the femoral artery, those are the two big ones, maybe even in the pelvic bowl, you have about 2 minutes of untreated bleeding out of that wound before you bleed out and die. Now, the golden hour that I referenced earlier, if you can get past that 2 minutes and you can get to a level 1 trauma center, you have a golden hour that if you have a very, very high success rate of making it out. And luckily, we have a level 1 trauma center right here in Knoxville. UT Hospital is a level 1 trauma center. There's a lot of people that have to come to UT from out of town. It's right in our backyard. So we're set. So when we talk about identifying bleeding, we want to look for what type. Just talked about capillary, venous, arterial. We want to look for how much blood is coming out, right? Where is it coming from? And it kind of gets tricky a little times, because you might come up on somebody and say their whole back, they've got their shirt on, their whole back is covered in blood. Well, they're probably not bleeding out of their entire back, right? There's probably one, maybe a couple spots where blood is coming out, but that shirt is soaking it up. So that makes it difficult. And that's where we have to search. We got to find where that blood's coming from, because that tells us how we treat it. We treat different areas of the body differently. So we want to look, Where's the blood coming from? How much is coming out? Is it pooling? Pooling blood is also a very scary thing because that tells us that the body's going into shock, right? And it's trying to trap as much blood in the body as it can. So these are all things that the 911 operator is going to want to know because it kind of gives us that clock. Right now, and if you've already clicked forward on the next slide, you probably got jump scared a little. Right now, you should have a video up, and it's a corpse, a pig corpse, that they're demonstrating. This is from the Committee on Tactical Combat Care. They are demonstrating an arterial bleed. Now, our key factor that tells us that it's an arterial bleed, and you should be seeing it now, is the spurt. So it's with the heartbeat. So every beat of the heart, you will see that jet of blood, and that tells you that it's arterial, right? This is the bad one. This is the widowmaker. This is a very, very short clock, and you're gonna have to get messy to keep this. I'll tell you a quick story of my dad. My dad's been in law enforcement 41 years, and when he was younger, a partner of his, somebody that he worked with, had got shot in the femoral artery, and this was in the 90s, right? Things are different. My dad had to reach in and pinch that artery and hold tight that artery until they were able to get him the care that he needed. This is what's going to happen. If we have an arterial bleed, somebody's hands are going to have to get messy. That's why it's so important to be able to identify. So I want you to watch that video, and I want you to be able to see the difference, the visual difference, and what an arterial bleed looks like, other than someone has a cut on their arm, a laceration, and blood kind of comes pooling out of it or oozing out of it versus jetting out, right? So this is what we want to be able to see and assess. Now, they could be bleeding in multiple spots, right? An injury doesn't always have to be singular located, especially the one that we don't want to talk about, gunshot wounds, right? And say a person gets shot. Well, they're probably going to have more than one injury. Lots of times there is an entry and an exit wound. Just because somebody gets shot in the leg doesn't exactly mean that if I get shot in the upper thigh that I'm going to have an exit wound on the back of my upper thigh. Rounds, bullets, ammunition hit bone, they bounce through the body, and they can eject in different areas of the body. So that's why we want to be visual people. And what I do is when I go to assess somebody, because not only can they have multiple injuries, but clothing can be very restrictive as well. I usually use my hand. So I have those gloves on, right? We'll go back to the analogy with somebody with the whole back of their shirt's wet with blood, right? I see that person, I'm going to take my hand, I'm going to put it on their back, probably going to be under their shirt. I'm going to put it on their back, and I'm going to locate those points of bleeding, just because that's going to get me the best care that I need. We have kits, and I unfortunately don't have one with me today, but we have kits placed all over the school. They are just real easy, compact bleeding control kits. They have a tourniquet, they have gauze, they have gloves, they have all these things, but another thing that they have in them is trauma shears. So if nobody's ever seen trauma shears, they're a weird pair of scissors. They kind of angle at the end and have a rounded tip. What they're made for is cutting clothes. Because in these violent incidents, in these critical incidents where somebody's injured and it's a matter of time for saving life, we don't have time, and this kind of sounds silly, we don't have time to worry about modesty and embarrassment and, there's an injury on the upper thigh. Well, I'm gonna cut your pants to shreds. I know that mom and dad spent a lot of money on them. I know you're probably gonna be embarrassed. This is gonna save your life. I'm gonna have to cut these pants off, right? And we'll do everything we can to make sure that everything's okay. But trauma shears are very important because that clothing can be so restrictive in, one, identifying, and two, treating the injury. Now, if you guys are following along with me on your slide, you should be on slide 16. Slide 16 is one of my favorite because it talks about the three main areas of the body that we have and how we're going to treat those differently. So area one that we talk about is going to be the extremities, right? Real easy. Arms, legs, extremities, super easy to treat. You can do anything. All of our treatment options can be used on any of the extremities. Now where it gets a little tricky is our second area, junction points. So our junction points are going to be the shoulders and armpits, and then the hips and the pelvis, and the neck. These are very, very difficult areas to treat. If you were with me last year, you got to hear my favorite story about when I'm teaching this class. We're talking about applications of tourniquets and pressure and all these different things, and how difficult it is to use those on the neck. And this was a very long time ago. This is several years ago. I had somebody ask me, well, why can't you tie a tourniquet around somebody's neck? Well, I just tossed him a tourniquet and asked him to try for himself. And he got about halfway through tightening a literal noose around his neck before he realized, oh, well, it may stop the bleeding, but it's also going to suffocate them. So, these junction points are very difficult to treat. It's hard to get something into a shoulder, into an armpit, around a neck that doesn't cause adverse damage. Another difficult area to treat, the last one we're going to talk about, is the box, right? Our torso. We can still use a lot of treatment options on it. We can pressure, we can pack. We can't use a tourniquet, right? There's not a tourniquet big enough to tie around, my whole torso. And if it does, it's probably not going to be very effective. So in our identification of where somebody's bleeding, we have to keep these three main areas of the body in mind. Are they bleeding in an extremity? Are they bleeding in a junction point? Are they bleeding in their torso, or the box, as I like to call it? And that will help us decide what course of action and what aid is going to be best, right? So C's. C of our ABC and bleeding is compress. And the way that we're going to talk about compress is we're going to talk about pressure. So pressure is going to be our first treatment option. Write this down. Pressure is going to be our first treatment option. It's going to be our most frequent treatment option because a majority of injuries, vast majority of bleeding injuries, can be treated simply with pressure, right? So we're going to identify, we're going to find the injury, and then we are going to treat it with pressure. You should have a video, slide 19. You'll have a video of one of the people from the Committee on Technical Combat Care. They have these things called baloney stacks. I call them baloney stacks. They're just like a long tubular skin-colored piece of foam, and that's how we use to train. So you'll have this video, and you'll see the instructor. She's identified a wound. She's got a hole, right? She's going to take this clean piece of cloth that she has, because you might not have access to gauze. If you have gauze, it's excellent. We want to use that. It's made for soaking up blood. It's made for this. If you don't, any clean cloth will work. She's using a t-shirt. She takes that t-shirt, she folds it over, and note that she doesn't use the whole t-shirt. You never want to use an excess amount of either gauze or cloth or whatever it is, because one, you can't really keep an eye on how much blood is still coming out, right? If you use too much, you're not going to see the blood soak through the material that you have. And number two, it can be restrictive in treating that. You're not going to get good enough pressure. But she takes just enough, two little handfuls, to cover that, and hand over hand, and applies pressure. I'm going to use my table here to show. She hand over hand, and she leans, right? She doesn't use all her strength. She's not, using just her arms and pushing down. She's using her weight. She's coming up over, and she's using her body weight. And you can do that all day. I can spend hours over top of somebody leaning because that's just gravity and that's just body weight. That's much easier than trying to use all my strength to push. So that's example number one, pressure and bleeding treatment. That's going to take care of a majority of your injuries, right? We love that. We love pressure. Number two, treatment option number two is going to be packing. So packing comes in when we have what greater than a superficial wound. What they usually turn into are cavities. Now, this could be a very deep laceration. This could be a gunshot wound. This could be an impaled object. There's a whole lot of things that could cause a cavity underneath the body. And the reason that they're so scary is it might not look like a whole lot on top, but underneath there could be a very, very large channel that is pooling with blood. And so there might not be a whole lot of blood coming out of the body, but there's still a very dangerous entry in there. And superficial pressure is not going to stop that injury because it's much deeper down in the skin. So you should have a quick graphic here that's going to show you the two different treatment options, side A and side B. Slide A is somebody packing a wound. So they have gloves on, they have their gauze, and they're stuffing it in. And hand over hand, they're stuffing it in. What they're going to do is they're going to fill that wound as much as they can so they can't stuff any more gauze in there. And then they're going to do the same thing that we already talked about, hand over hand and hold pressure. So even when pressure isn't our main treatment option, we're always going to go back to it, right? Even when we're packing, we're going to pack the wound, we're going to get the gauze in there, and then we're going to hold pressure. We're never going to remove that gauze either. Once you give treatment, do not remove, do not take out, because you're either going to undo all the efforts that you just did or you're going to make it worse. It's never going to make it better. Your job is simply to render as much aid as you can till the medical professionals get there. And when they get them to a hospital and they get them to a secure place, that's when that stuff will be removed. But your job is just keep that on there until it's ready. You should have a second video of another instructor, and they're going to, slide 21, they're going to demonstrate packing. And you'll be amazed how much gauze that this woman gets into this small injury. What we see as a small injury on the surface, she gets almost a whole roll of gauze in there. And it's just, she's full fist over and over and over again. She fills that wound. And lots of times this course tells you to save the remainder, what you don't use, try and prevent waste. I'll actually tell you that once you open up a pack of gauze, you're never going to repack it and use it again, right? You know, you might cut it off at the moment, but if you're using 3/4 of a roll of gauze to pack a wound, don't cut it off and try and save the rest. Use the rest to place on top and to pack and keep that pressure, right? So watch this video, watch her pack this wound, be amazed by how much comes in there, and then step down to slide 22 with me. And I apologize now. This is a very, very deep laceration on the upper thigh of a woman. I don't know all the details behind the injury, but you can see how her whole leg is almost splayed open. So the first slide that we have, you see a medical professional packing the wound, stuffing gauze. They've got their gloves on, they're getting the gauze in there, they're trying to treat the wound. Second picture is the rough one. This person has 2 full hands inside this injury, stuffing gauze inside. So that just tells you what on the surface would just see as a cut or a scratch. Once it's expanded or on the inside is a huge wound that we have to be able to treat. And then the third image is 2 full hands on top of that roll of gauze. And now that they've packed the wound, now that they've got the gauze down onto wherever that bleeding is, whether it's out of a vein or an artery, they're going to hold pressure and they're going to do everything that they can to slow down that blood loss, right? Until they can either clamp it or do what they're going to do. So the good news is when it comes to pressure, we can use this on all 3 of our areas of the body. Extremities, box, and junction points can all have pressure on them. Now, we'll go back to the neck. Might be difficult if you're going to hold pressure onto somebody's neck. You know, you don't want to hold too much pressure, right? So it's something that you would have to play by ear, but it is a treatment option. So we can use that on all 3 areas of the body. It's wonderful. Packing, same thing. You can use it on extremities, you can use it on the torso, the box, you can use it on the junction points. But once again, you're going to have to be a little more careful, right? If you're stuffing something into somebody's neck or into their armpit, it's going to be a little more difficult, but it is a valid treatment option. So those are our first 2 treatment options. Our third treatment option, my personal favorite, but is not used in every case, are tourniquets. So most of you know I keep a tourniquet on me at all times. This is usually the disclaimer. This is my tourniquet. And that might sound rude, but this is for me. This is to save my life and my life alone. I can't help anybody if I'm out of the fight. So this is mine. This is the one that I keep on me to save my life and my life alone. We have dozens all over the building to save everybody else's life. Now, we have different kinds. And my personal favorite, I have one with me today. These are called soft T tourniquets. And these are the really, really heavy duty, fancy ones to use. Now, the reason that I don't carry one of these on me at all times is because they're a little more cumbersome and not as easy to get a little belt holster for, and they're a little more expensive too. So, but they're my personal favorite. Now, how we want to treat with the tourniquet is very simple. So, you can't put them on any area of the body. We already talked about I'm not able to tie a tourniquet around my waist. There's a good reason why I wouldn't put it around my neck and tighten it, right? It's pretty simple. Don't have to talk about the details too much. So tourniquets are really only used for injuries in the extremities. So if I have an injury to my left arm, I'm going to take the tourniquet, I'm going to place it as high and tight as I can, and then I'm going to cinch it down, right? And if I can encourage you, if you ever practice, and if you want to, come and find me. Come and find me, and we'll practice tourniquet application. Always practice one-armed, because, well, you know, if you're applying a tourniquet, you're probably not going to be able to use that other extremity, right? Not going to be able to use that arm. So I'm going to tighten it down as much as I can with the cinch. And then I'm going to use what's called the whistlet. And I'm going to crank that whistlet until I can't crank it anymore. Then I'm going to use whatever securing feature, whatever fastening feature the tourniquet that I'm using has. I'm going to lock it in place. And what you want to do, as soon as you lock it in place, you want to take note of the time, because the emergency professionals, when they get there, when they ask you, when the treatment happened, first thing they're going to ask about the tourniquet is when the tourniquet was applied. Because what you're doing is you're cutting off blood flow to that entire limb, right? Which is a good thing, because you don't want the blood coming out of the limb, but you're slowly killing it. So a matter of time is always important. Our PowerPoint, our presentation, and the Stop the Bleed course advises you to apply a tourniquet 2 to 3 inches above the injury. I'm a big fan of high and tight. It's never going to hurt to put it as high on the extremity as you can. As close to the shoulder, if it's a leg, as close to the hip. That way you're not having to worry about putting it too close to the injury. So me personally, I'm a fan of high and tight. You're never going to put it over an elbow or a knee, right? Shoulders, elbows, knees. It's just not going to tighten down properly, right? Those are bony joints. It won't work. There's not a whole lot to say there. And you are going to tighten it and tighten it and tighten it until the bleeding stops. You're not going to stop when the person says, ow, stop, because it's going to hurt. I promise you it's going to hurt. This does not feel good, but it's important you guys might even be able to see the change in colors. I can see it. So it's important to know it's going to hurt. They're going to tell you to stop. Don't stop. Do not stop. You don't stop tightening the tourniquet until the bleeding is controlled, until the bleeding completely stops. And your last tip for a tourniquet is do not ever remove the tourniquet, because you have created pressure, you've created a vacuum, right? So as soon as that tourniquet's removed, all that blood that's built up above it is going to come flying out. It's going to burst veins. It's going to make for a major blood loss. That does not need to happen until they are in the care of medical professionals that know how to take care of that. So tourniquets are very versatile because they can apply to you. They can be applied to others. They're easy to use. They're not hard to understand. They can be put on over clothes. They're super, super versatile. So it's one of my favorite treatment options, but like I said, it's not one that we're going to use in every scenario. Number one, we're always going to use pressure. If pressure doesn't work, we're going to move to packing. Pressure and packing doesn't work, we're going to move to a tourniquet. But they're very effective, very easy to use. And it's possible that a second tourniquet might even be needed. That does happen from time to time, just because the amount of, it could be a large injury, large volume of blood. You might need two. It's possible. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means that it's a very massive injury. So on slide 28, you should be able to see a video of somebody applying a tourniquet. Now what they're using is separate from mine, or the one that I just showed you. They're using the Cat T tourniquets, same one that I carry on me, same one that's in all of our kits. It's a much more commercially available tourniquet. It's very, very simple, very easy to use. And you even see them slide it up over the man's arm, over his clothes, and apply it. And you might see the white tab that they use to tighten it down at the end. It says time. So those kits I talked about earlier, those kits I mentioned earlier, do come with a marker and that tourniquet. So you are able to mark on that tourniquet the time that it was applied. And that will help the medical professionals whenever they get arrived and they are treating that wound. Our next slide, slide 29, is going to show off a bunch of different tourniquets. We've talked about two, right? We've talked about the Soft T and the Cat T, or CAT, Combat Application Tourniquet. Those are really the only two I recommend. The other ones that we have on here, the SAM XT, the RMT, TMT, all of these, I'll be honest with you, I've never seen in my life. I haven't seen fire trucks, I haven't seen firemen and medical professionals, I haven't seen emergency medical services on ambulance. I've never seen anybody use these. I don't know where they come from, but the Stop the Bleed course recommends them for use. I've never seen them. I don't know them. If you want to get your own and you want to be ready or you want to practice, there is a kit on Amazon. It's a bleeding control kit. It's the same one I've been talking about this whole time. It's $20. $20 gets you a pack of hemostatic gauze, which is very important, gloves, Sharpie, trauma shears, and the tourniquet. It's great. I've got one in my car. I've got one in my backpack. Anywhere and everywhere I'm ever at, I have at least one of those on me because it's easy to just throw in a bag and go. I recommend buying them What I don't recommend is if you're going to train with the tourniquet, don't train with one that you might use. The more times that this is wrung out and used, the elasticity and the usefulness kind of goes down, right? So you can buy training tourniquets. They're usually about $10 a piece. I have several of those at the house. And that's another thing. If you ever want to train with the tourniquet, ask me. I'll bring you one. We'll train. We'll use it. Get you comfortable with the application. But don't train with one that you plan on using in the future or hope that you don't have to use, right? So we have all these different tourniquets. One that I want to talk about that I added, you should see in slide 32. This is called a SWAT T tourniquet. It's the big orange one, the big long roll. What this is a self-adhering kind of rubbery tourniquet. So it's just one long roll, and you'll put it on an injury, and you kind of wrap it around, and it'll stick to itself. And you'll just wrap it around, wrap it around, wrap it around until you run out, and it adheres to itself. Pardon me. The SWAT T will adhere to itself, and it's a very useful tourniquet. They're very cheap and expensive. The first time I ever saw them, I was still working for Knox County in their school security division, and they bought, or rather, there was a grant that paid for bleeding control kits for every school, and every school got a number of them based on school attendance, school numbers, enrollment, I guess would be the good word. So we at my school got about 36 of these. Every kit had one of these SWAT T tourniquets. I'd never seen them before, and they were wonderful. So easy to use, so fast to get out and apply, and they were great until kids started stealing them from the kits and using them to kind of pull back and smack each other with, and then it was a free for all at that point. But these you can usually find $8 to $10. I know a lot of people that use them are hunters and fishermen and things like that because they're water resistant. They're super, super easy to use when your hands are covered in water or blood, if you're out hunting or whatever it might be. They're very, very easy to use. So that's another one that I recommend. I know a lot of guys that keep them in their trucks, on their boats, same things like that. One of the last things that we're going to talk about today, and this is especially important to us, imperative for us, is bleeding control in children. So a lot of people are concerned when it comes to children, small bodies. How do I take care of them, and how do I stop that critical injury with that small body? Well, the good news is, for the most part, you will always use the same treatment options and same treatment types. Now, it might vary on how much you use, but you're still going to pressure, you're still going to pack, and you can even apply a tourniquet. You're going to have to tighten that tourniquet down a lot more because a 6, 7, if you're in preschool, maybe a 4 or 5, their bodies are obviously a lot smaller than ours. So you might have to tighten it down more, but you can use all of these things. Everything that we've talked about today, you can still use in children. The only time that you might not is in especially small infants, right? You can't apply a tourniquet to a body like that, but you can still pressure and you can still pack. So that's the good news. Good news is all of our stuff can be used with children, which is great for us and what we talked about. Now, this point is typically where we have a question and answer section, right? There's nobody to ask questions today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over frequently asked questions that I get, and you should have a copy of them in your presentation. So impaled objects. We talked earlier about the video that I saw where lightning struck a tree and shot a piece of tree into a woman, impaled her. Some of you may have heard the story that I had when I was very, very new into this job. I had a first grader that got a pencil stuck in his neck. So impaled objects are real scary. Question I get all the time is, what do we do about them? Short answer, don't touch them. Leave them. You never, ever, ever pull an impaled object out of a person's body, right? Because lots of times that object is holding pressure in. And it's probably going to be an issue with that person wanting to remove that object. Your job might be to stop them from removing that, because that's going to cause way more harm than good. Improvised tourniquets. Improvised tourniquets are a question that people ask a lot about and are kind of a taboo issue in the community of emergency care. So I am all for improvised tourniquets when done properly. Now, there's never going to be a time that you grabbing a stick and a t-shirt and tying that around somebody is better than a tourniquet that you have to use. But if you don't have that as an option, if you don't have a tourniquet as an option, you can use a dog leash, you can use a belt, a man's belt lots of times. There's many different things that you can do to try and hold pressure onto that extremity and slow down the blood loss. You actually have a video in your presentation at the end that shows an officer that was responding to a 14-year-old that had shot himself, couldn't find his tourniquet. He's a canine handler, so what does he do? He grabs the leash, he goes, ties the leash down on the kid, is able to keep everything okay until the paramedics get there. So that's my stance on improvised tourniquets. Loss of an arm or a leg is another question that we get a lot when it comes to tourniquet application. Like we said earlier, you're killing that limb. You're cutting off all the blood flow, everything to that limb. What I can tell you is there has never been a recorded case where someone has lost a limb as a direct result of a tourniquet application. That sounds like a very PR answer, and it is. What we do have data on is people in Afghanistan, Iraq, all these different places, our armed service members that have had injuries, and they've had application or tourniquets applied for an upwards of 12 to 14 hours that did not lose a limb. So you are more than likely never going to be in a situation where the tourniquet that you're applying or one that has been applied to you is going to be on for that long of a time, right? These guys are getting airlifted hours away to whatever, medical facility that they're going to. It's not going to happen to you. So we've never seen a loss of a limb as a direct result of a tourniquet application. Now, it's going to hurt. I'm telling you, it's going to hurt. And whoever you're putting that tourniquet on, if you're doing it right, they're going to beg you to take it off. It does not feel good. But your job is to keep that person as calm as possible, apply that tourniquet, and keep it on. Never, ever, ever take it off. All right. Last thing I'll cover is the 2 videos that you have at the end of your slide. So we talked about the last one. Officer responds to a young man that shot himself, uses an improvised tourniquet. It's a great video to look and see how that works and how you might be able to stay calm and improvise in a critical incident. The first one is to show you an arterial bleed, right? So these are men on a biking trail. I believe they were in France, and one of the guys crashes his bike, and I don't know if it was a tree limb or something, but something impaled him in his inner thigh, cut the femoral artery. So it's another great example of how to stay calm in a situation, because his buddy stays extremely calm. Immediately goes to holding pressure. He uses his knee, he uses his body weight. Everything that we talked about today saves this man life. It's a wonderful video to watch. So watch those 2. If you ever have any questions, feel free. Please do not hesitate to ask me. I walk around all day. I love to answer questions. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. If you ever want to train, let me know. I can set up a training. But other than that, I appreciate your time today. Thank you. Have a great day.